Hi folks, welcome to Module 6 of Christian Worldview, and in this session we're going to look at the characteristic of what I'm going to call our secular age. This class is based largely on the sort of question that was asked by Charles Taylor in his now very famous book, A Secular Age, and it's probably important that you're aware of this work. Charles Taylor is a Canadian Catholic philosopher, very prominent contemporary intellectual, and he basically asked the question, how did we get to a point where it was even conceivable that there was no supernatural element or supernatural dimension to existence. And he's kind of asking the question because this is a very peculiar aspect of our Western culture. It's not a characteristic of other cultures that accept a much more sort of multi-dimensional view of reality. But he actually is kind of recognizes that there's actually a mindset that this is created for us, that we actually in some ways, well, according to him, we can't we now can't uncreate it. It's the mindset that he analyzes in this book. It's the secular mindset, and it contrasts with a mindset that just took it for granted as a matter of immediate knowledge or intuition that there was, a supernatural element to reality and even a God. So he, says that, 500 years ago, it was inconceivable. You wouldn't even ask the question whether there was or was not a God. It was just taken for granted. And so he asked the question, how did we get to this place where we are today? And he wants to both analyze how we got there and also analyze the sort of mindset, this secular mindset. So it's a really, really valuable work, particularly for contemporary Christians, and which is why we're going to follow the thread of this argument, but I'm going to go in a few different directions with this as well. I'm going to start by introducing this language, the language of disenchantment. This is a way of describing what has happened over the last 500 years, particularly through the scientific revolution and the so-called Enlightenment. There is this process of disenchantment. The term disenchantment was borrowed from the philosopher Friedrich Schiller by the sociologist, very famous German sociologist Max Weber, to describe the character of modernized, bureaucratic, secularized Western society. In Western society, according to Weber, scientific understanding is more highly valued than belief, and processes are oriented towards rational goals as opposed to traditional society, whereby the world remains, as he says, a great enchanted garden. And Max Weber famously said, the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. Mircea Eliade, who was a scholar of religion and philosopher at the University of Chicago, in his book, The Sacred and the Profane, says this. He says, it should be said at once that the completely profane world, the wholly desacralized cosmos, is a recent discovery in the history of the human spirit. He goes on to say, but it is only in the modern societies of the West that non-religious man has developed fully. Modern non-religious man assumes a new existential situation. He regards himself solely as the subject and agent of history, and he refuses all appeal to transcendence. In other words, he accepts no model for humanity outside the human condition as it can be seen in the various historical situation. Man makes himself, and he only makes himself, completely in proportion as he desacralizes himself and the world. The sacred is the prime obstacle to his freedom. He will become himself only when he is totally demysticized. He will not be truly free until he has killed the last God. Taylor points out that there is a condition of lived experience where the moral spiritual is as immediate reality, like stones, rivers, and mountains. Now, part of what has happened, he says, in our civilization is that we have largely eroded these forms of immediate certainty. And what he's talking about, this immediate sort of intuition of the moral spiritual dimension to experience. Science, he says, in helping to disenchant the universe, contributed to opening the way for exclusive humanism. A crucial condition for this was a new sense of the self and its place in the cosmos, not open and porous and vulnerable to a world of spirits and powers, but what I want to call buffered. But it took, he goes on to say, but it took more than disenchantment to produce the buffered self. It was also necessary to have confidence in our own powers of moral ordering. Those are key terms there that Taylor uses. He speaks of the sort of pre-modern, the pre-enlightenment self as a porous, in a state of porousness. There's that immediate knowledge of a spiritual aspect to reality, and so he describes that as porous, and he contrasts that to, and this is really how he characterizes the secular, not only the secular mindset actually, but the sort of secular existential situation that he refers to as buffered. And I think that's really powerful. Both those terms are really powerful ways of describing this situation. So buffered, we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on. He goes on to say, the enchanted world, in contrast to our universe of buffered selves and minds, shows a perplexing absence of certain boundaries which seem to us essential. Here is the contrast between the modern bounded self, I want to say buffered self, and the porous self of the earlier enchanted world. What difference does this make? He says, a very different existential condition. So it's not just a mindset, it's a whole different way of existing and relating to the reality around us. He goes on, to put the point in different terms, belief in God isn't quite the same thing in 1500 and 2000. The difference I've been talking about is one of the whole background framework in which one believes or refuses to believe in God. The frameworks of yesterday and today are related as naive and reflective, because the latter has opened a question which had been foreclosed in the former by the unacknowledged shape of the background. It is this shift in background, in the whole context in which we experience and search for fullness, that I'm calling the coming of a secular age. So what he's talking about there is again, and these are disconnected quotes from his book that I'm sort of throwing in here to point to what he's talking about. So he's trying to describe the fact that even as believers now, there's a different kind of background, there's a different mental sort of background, a different mental condition, even for believers with which we believe, because in a sense, skepticism is an option where it wasn't even an option before. You couldn't even conceive of not believing, whereas now that's an option. So there's this sort of, for a lot of people, this constant wrestle between, our skepticism and belief. But it's actually, and this is the point he makes, it's actually not just skepticism. It's not just an intellectual thing. The whole that whole skeptical mindset actually comes from a very unique and typically modern existential state that he is referring to here as a buffered state. Now, as we go into this more, I'll clarify further what this buffered state of this buffered existential situation looks like. However, while all this is true, as James K.A. Smith says in his book on a secular age, and there's a number of books that have been written about Taylor's book, The Secular Age. He says, Taylor names and identifies what some of our best novelists, poets and artists attest to, that our age is haunted. On the one hand, we live under a brass heaven, ensconced in immanence, and the immanence is a way of talking about shutting out anything transcendent. So we've shut out any sort of transcendent reality, and all we have is what Taylor refers to as the immanent frame. Just what we can sort of grasp with our senses and our logic and so forth. So, but Taylor points out that there's a sense, and this is what James K. Smith is highlighting from Taylor's book, is that we're kind of haunted by this this residue of this intuition that we have. It's almost been more suppressed really than anything. Like it's still there, but in a more very much repressed sense. So he goes on to say, we live in the twilight of both gods and idols, but their ghosts have refused to depart, and every once in a while we might be surprised to find ourselves tempted by belief, by intimations of transcendence. Mircea Eliade talks a lot about this kind of thing also in his book The Sacred and the Profane. He says here, in short, the majority of men without religion still hold to pseudo-religions and degenerated mythologies. There is nothing surprising in this, for as we saw, profane man is the descendant of Homo religiosus, and he cannot wipe out his own history, that is, the behavior of his religious ancestors, which has made him what he is today. This is all the more true because a great part of his existence is fed by impulses that come to him from the depths of his being, from the zone that has been called the unconscious. From one point of view, he goes on to say, it could almost be said that in the case of those moderns who proclaim that they are non-religious, religion and mythology are eclipsed in the darkness of their unconscious, which means too that in such men the possibility of reintegrating a religious vision of life lies at great depth. And he continues, or from the Christian point of view, it could also be said that non-religion is equivalent to a new fall of man. In other words, that non-religious man has lost the capacity to live religion consciously and hence to understand and assume it, but that in his deepest being, he still retains a memory of it, as after the first fall, his ancestor, the primordial man, retained intelligence enough to enable him to rediscover the traces of God that are visible in the world. After the first fall, the religious sense descended to the level of the divided consciousness. Now, after the second, it has fallen even further into the depths of the unconscious. It has been forgotten. As Julian Barnes says in his novel Nothing to be Frightened of, he says, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. Well, this raises the question, so how did we get here? And this is where I want to get into a little bit more detail and follow some of the elements of our particular culture that led us to get to this point. In the 18th century, when we'll start with the Enlightenment, there arose this intellectual movement that its proponents referred to, and I would say very much euphemistically and hyperbolically, as the Enlightenment. Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, Adam Smith, Hume, Kant, Lessing, Christian Wolff, and so forth. The Enlightenment is characterized by three main tenets. The first of which is that science determines reality. There is no reality in this Enlightenment way of thinking. There is no reality outside of what science can potentially deal with. Now, it's a very narrow-minded way of thinking, and this is something that Taylor points out. But that is one of the key tenets of the Enlightenment. The other one is that the human mind is the arbiter of truth. So man becomes the measure of all things. And thirdly, human happiness is the ultimate social good. Those are the three main tenets. Well, these should sound familiar to you because these are the characteristics of our secular culture as well. The Enlightenment had its primary origin in the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. The dramatic success of the new science in explaining the natural world promoted philosophy from being a handmaiden of theology to an independent force with the power and authority to challenge the old and construct the new. Philosophy came to be seen as the key to improving human life. There arose a great confidence in humanity's intellectual powers, both to achieve systematic knowledge of nature and to serve as an authoritative guide in practical life. This enthusiasm for intellectual progress was represented by the production of the first encyclopedia, which was edited by Denis Diderot and Jean Laronde d'Alembert. This work aims to provide a compendium of existing human knowledge to be transmitted to subsequent generations, a transmission intended to contribute to the progress and dissemination of human knowledge and to a positive transformation of human society. A key ambition of the Enlightenment program was, of course, emancipation of people from self-entitled hierarchies like kings and popes and so forth. By this time, the Church had become so infused with the state that it was therefore seen as part of the problem. Enlightenment thinkers advocated basic human rights and equality of all people. Immanuel Kant, in answer to this question, what is enlightenment, says this: enlightenment is humankind's release from its self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. The belief of the Enlightenment is that the process of enlightenment, of becoming progressively self-directed in thought and action through the awakening of one's intellectual powers, leads ultimately to a better and more fulfilled human existence. Well, again, that's a bit of a summary of the Enlightenment, but let's jump into this in a little bit more detail now. Well, firstly, there's a very important shift from basically an Aristotelian universe to a Newtonian universe. So for Aristotle, the universe was animated by this world soul. It had this very organic, almost spiritual aspect. It was all things are guided from within by form, and there is this internal telos. There's this guiding force moving everything from its state of potentiality to a state of actuality, and it's all very guided, and it's kind of mystical, almost spiritual, and very organic. But after Newton and Newton's picture of the universe as a big machine, you get a sort of breakdown of that old Aristotelian view, and suddenly in the Newtonian view you get this idea of a universe, as I said, like a big machine. It's just objects sitting in space with, relating to each other causally, one thing causing another, governed by the rules of mathematics and force and energy and so forth. So this is a very important movement, actually, the movement from the Aristotelian and to the Newtonian universe. This step is important to recognize, actually, particularly now, because in contemporary thought, there's been quite a move back to the Aristotelian view of the universe. With the advent of quantum theory and so forth, as well as a number of other factors in contemporary science, there is increasingly this sense in which there is kind of some sense of mind at work in all things, and that certainly the natural world does seem to be guided by some sort of mind force. However, that's put in a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily come from a theistic point of view. Panpsychism, for example, thinks that a fundamental aspect of reality is mental. So there are different ways of accounting to this, but it's interesting to note that in the Enlightenment you get this move from this Aristotelian, mystical Aristotelian view of the universe to this mechanistic Newtonian view. There's a real confidence in this Newtonian view. We can understand everything. It's just objects in space, and it's all governed by mathematics, and it's all completely comprehensible. And of course, in the 20th century, that completely broke down because they recognized that when you get to the quantum level, there are actually there's a fundamental mysteriousness to the universe, which is partly what has led back to the Aristotelian view. So a lot of people don't realize this actually, but this is in very broad strokes. This is at least the movement from the Aristotelian view to the sort of post-Newtonian view. You also get a move in method, very important movement here from Aristotle's logical science to an experimental approach to science that was promoted by the philosopher Francis Bacon, who wanted to get away from the sort of Aristotelian way of trying to grasp the bigger picture and how all things relate together, and he just wanted something that worked. He just wanted us to learn how through experimentation to basically harness and control the forces of nature. So there was a sort of very practical view of knowledge for Francis Bacon. So you get then this new scientific method, observation, questioning, hypothesis, experimentation, analysis, forming conclusions, and so forth. And this scientific method, slowly, and it does evolve. The scientific method, of course, does evolve, but this then becomes really the arbiter for all truth. It sort of breaks its, breaks out of its bounds. It should be a way of, one way of investigating the natural world, but it quickly became a way of, of sort of settling questions of ultimate truth even. And so anything that could not be solved by the scientific method was eventually deemed to be completely invalid even as a question. And so you start to get even here the beginnings of what would shut out a more ultimate reality. And so you get this new scientific knowledge, and people are really enamored by this. It works. They're able to harness nature and do amazing things, and so scientists become the sort of new mediators of knowledge, and you even get a change in what kind of will count as knowledge. What counts as knowledge is only what can be verified potentially through the scientific method. Well, to understand this, I'm going to take a little bit of a philosophical line here and talk a little bit about René Descartes and the sort of worldview that this creates, because of course we're interested in worldview here, and we want to investigate how this way of thinking sort of took place. So we're going to start with the French philosopher René Descartes, the generally regarded as the father of modern philosophy. So for Descartes, he was looking for a reliable method by which we can advance knowledge. He wanted a new approach to human inquiry that wouldn't just be based on tradition or the hearsay of generations before or authority or so forth. No, he wanted a new way, a new basis for knowledge. So what he does is that he sets about doubting everything. He doubts everything, and he's only going to accept as true what he finds rationally indubitable. So it's like he's clearing out the space and only putting back what he feels rationally compelled to put back. Descartes reflects that he's often found himself to be mistaken with regards to matters that he formerly thought were certain, and he resolves to sweep away all of his preconceptions, rebuilding his knowledge from the ground up and accepting as true only those claims which are absolutely certain. All that he had previously thought he knew came to him through the senses. So through a process of methodological doubt, he withdraws completely from the senses. He recalls times when, while dreaming, he assumed that his experience was real, when on awakening he realized that it wasn't real after all. So he poses a thought experiment. He imagines he is in the hands of some kind of evil demon that is set on deceiving him about everything he experiences. The scenario is pretty much the scenario that is set up in the film The Matrix. He asks the question, is there anything about which this evil demon would not be able to deceive him? Well, he finds one thing to be certain initially. He cannot doubt his own existence. In order to doubt or to think, there must be someone doing the doubting or thinking. He knows at least that he is a thing that thinks. And so the famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He further reasons that he comes to know this fact by means of his intellect, and that the mind is far better known to him than the body. So then there's the outward term. He thinks to himself, I've proven that I exist. Now I need to prove the existence of a body and of an external world to avoid solipsism. Solipsism is this perspective that we can't be sure that anything fed to us by the senses is real. Now, the only thing available to him, of course, because he's denying everything that the senses are feeding to him, the only thing available to him now is the contents of his consciousness. And he thinks and asks the question, is there something in the contents of my consciousness that can lead me outside of myself, out of this epistemological hole? Well, he discovers among the contents of his consciousness the conception of God, of one besides whom nothing greater can be imagined, a supremely good and perfect infinite being, non-contingent, so forth. And he thinks that the mere fact that he has this idea proves the fact that there must be one who corresponds to this idea. These ideas cannot originate in his finite mind or in anything else in the world. The lesser cannot give rise to the greater, and it cannot even come from the hypothetical evil demon. Because God is the ultimate good, Descartes reasons, he cannot deceive and would be concerned for our intellectual welfare. So if we do our part and think through things rationally and don't assent rashly to things that we haven't thought out properly, then God will validate the things that we are disposed to believe. So Descartes founds our knowledge of the world on the self-evident existence of God. So he argues, I have this disposition to believe in the external world, and I have done everything to eradicate false ideas about it. I can therefore trust in God's providence that this disposition is not misleading. That's how he gets himself out of, as I said, that epistemological hole. But the interesting thing, and this is the thing that I want to highlight, so that's a very, very quick summary of sort of how Descartes escapes from solipsism. But it's interesting to note what actually happens as a result of this. And you'll notice that he even has this belief in God, and you might think, well, that's all very good and so forth. But there's actually something very significant that happens here, very significant shift in a way of thinking that actually happens here. So basically, Descartes denies everything that experience presents to him, all the things that human beings had previously taken for granted. In a sense, he cleans out the house in order to bring back only those things that meet his rational criteria. By this method, Descartes has arrived at a certain view of the external world. He's put things back in a different way. You see, in putting things back, Descartes has actually reconstituted his world in a completely different way. Now, up to this point, it was the Aristotelian view of the world that dominated, as I've said. In this scheme, matter was animated by mind. Okay, within all of matter, there was this kind of rational principle that was often referred to as soul or the logos, as we've seen. But Descartes basically dualizes the world. He separates mind from matter. And so he also separates the knowing subject from the known object. This is a very, very important move. Descartes separates the knowing subject from the known object. In other words, what we get here is a reality that consists of two distinct substances, and this is known as Cartesian dualism. Two substances are mind on the one hand and matter. So we are fundamentally minds, but we have bodies that are made of matter. And so you have these two aspects of reality, mind and matter. Now, the world of matter is understood primarily and in fact wholly in terms of extension. Matter is characterized by the fact that it just takes up space. Okay, it's geometric in nature, and this can be then probed through mathematics. Okay, so you get this beginning of this idea of there are minds, and but then otherwise we're just dealing with objects in space. You know, and these objects have mathematical properties. They're extended objects, so they have these mathematical properties, and they relate to each other in ways that are mathematical, that can be mathematically predicted as well. Now, this is going to lead to the birth of mathematical physics, beginning with Isaac Newton. And, you know, this is part of this movement from an Aristotelian view of the world as this sort of mystically guided organism, you know, guided from within by a world soul in accordance with an ultimate purpose or final cause, as Aristotle would say. You know, Descartes rejects the splitting of corporeal substance into matter and form. There is only matter. You know, and matter is just inanimate stuff. Its essence is just that of extension. Okay, so Descartes' world is geometrical and mathematical in nature. And as I said, this paves the way for Newtonian mathematical physics, which of course is going to replace Descartes' view for its sophistication, but it basically grows out of the same idea. The world, according to Descartes, is so constructed that the human mind is capable of knowing about it. The mind and the world are made for each other by God, according to Descartes. But what this means is that man, in essence, is not really part of the world. Man is essentially mind, an immaterial intellectual substance. But he is well adjusted for knowing the world, and this means that we can conduct a mathematical physics. So this constitutes a scientific revolution. This is the birth of, as I said, of mathematical physics. Descartes is a rationalist. He thinks that the fundamental properties of the world are rational and can be discovered through rational reflection. The senses provide data, but this data can't be counted on as knowledge until reason has interpreted it. But you get this division. You know, man is not essentially not really part of the world. Man is a mind that perceives the world and thinks about the world or the universe as an object. So this is really the essence of the buffered self that Taylor talks about. It's a very unnatural situation. You get this situation where, you know, we are subjects' minds who try to relate to the world, well, not just the world, but reality as such. Reality becomes this object, and we probe it with questions. But it's like we, as minds, are somehow removed from this reality. That we try to grasp intellectually, as though, you know, we're here and reality is there, and, you know, whether we're talking about a sort of conceptual hypothesis or actual scientific, you know, objects, The world is divided now into subjects, we are the subjects, and objects. Everything is objects now. Everything is sort of the object of our investigation. In fact, even God becomes an object of our inquiry. So this is, as I said, the essence of the buffered self. Now, it's interesting to note here that even though Descartes was, of course, a theist, he believed in God, yet he paves the way for essentially man kind of replacing God, so that, you know, we are the ones that sort of stand outside reality now, looking in on reality. We're the minds that view reality as an object. Whereas, I mean, in previous times, that would be a preposterous idea, because that only God has that objective sort of point of view. Only God can look at all reality in that way. But now you've got human beings as essentially rationally autonomous. We look in on reality and we probe reality with these questions. And we even pose these questions about God and even discuss the things about God as though God himself were an object of our inquiry, as though God could ever be that. Well, it's this philosophy really that paves the way for the so-called Enlightenment. And as I said, that you also get this new kind of mechanistic view of the universe. This was also the beginning of a separation of the physical from the metaphysical. The physical world was no longer divinely sustained, but it was simply subject to physical laws with no need for God other than as a first cause. And so you get this separation. There's still, people still acknowledge God, but God is the one that sort of created and wound up the big machine, and then, which is the universe, and then just let it run on its own. And every now and again, according to this conception of God, which is known as deism, God sort of pops in and makes some alterations here and there. But otherwise, the whole world is just this big machine that runs on its own, and there you have the separation of the physical from the metaphysical. Now, I should point out again, this view of the universe, this mechanistic view of the universe, completely changed in the 20th century, and so we're back to something actually that looks far more metaphysical in nature. But what grew out of this was a new kind of skepticism, and even for believers, actually a new way of even thinking about God, sort of a deist conception of God that we'll talk about in the next module. This Enlightenment skepticism really culminated in the Scottish philosopher David Hume. For David Hume, all knowledge is based on observation of the facts. All knowledge is derived from the senses. In this, he follows John Locke, who had said there is nothing in the mind except what was first in the senses. The mind, according to John Locke, is like passive wax upon which sensation of the world leaves its imprint. So David Hume and John Locke are empiricists, and the empiricism really becomes the mainstay of the Enlightenment way of thinking, right into the early 20th century, in fact. According to Hume, if an idea is not related to an empirical fact, then it just has no content. It's completely meaningless. So ideas like justice, evil, God, spirit, they just have no meaning. And so in this, he anticipates what in the early 20th century became logical positivism. Now, logical positivism, it's important to note, it died out really certainly by the 60s. It was completely dead as a philosophical movement. So this very kind of way of thinking did actually die out in the 20th century. But this is the classic skepticism that gave rise to, for example, the new atheism really still comes from this kind of philosophical skepticism. And so Hume famously said, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, he says, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So if it doesn't relate to mathematical mathematical truths that are sort of self-evident, and if it doesn't relate to experimental facts, then it's all illusion, and it needs to be discarded. And that kind of is the character that becomes the character of modern skepticism. So this leads then, as I said, to positivism. Positivism basically is the position which says that all genuine human knowledge is contained within the bounds of science. Well, this is how we get then the origin of the modern mind. First of all, in Descartes, reality is an object apprehended by a subject, and then after Hume, you get this idea that only apprehendable objects are even real. So this positivism is an important step in the sort of development of that characteristically modern form of skepticism. Even though this position as a philosophical position is no longer really tenable, yet it's a key step in the evolution of the modern mind. Again, positivism is the view that the only authentic knowledge is scientific knowledge, and that such knowledge can only come from positive affirmation of theories through strict scientific method. This then leads to a position that's been referred to as scientism, and scientism is the attitude that says that there is no reality outside of what can potentially be grasped through the scientific method. This is exemplified, for example, in Peter Atkins, who says there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. It's a massive, big statement to make. Well, if you combine everything that I've said so far then with the rise, of course, of Darwinism, you end up actually with a Darwinistic worldview. And of course, Darwin was concerned with the origin of the species, but his ideas have been broadened to pretty much embrace all of reality. This is the thesis, for example, in Daniel Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, where he sees Darwin's idea of evolution through natural selection as in the illustration he uses, it's a kind of a universal acid that just destroys, erodes away everything else. It has a universal application. So he thinks that we can account for all of reality through the power of what he calls an algorithm. So we can account for everything that exists just through the working of blind algorithms. And he finds this idea initially in Darwin, and he applies it to all things. So basically, everything right up to intelligent life on Earth, the whole of the universe has emerged as a sort of a mindless unfolding of a great algorithm. Darwin had argued that historical species are not eternal and immutable, as Aristotle had argued. Rather, according to Darwin, they have evolved over time and can give birth to new species in turn. Now, there was a very strong Aristotelian bias against this idea. The bias against Darwin's view actually initially wasn't primarily from Christians. It was from within the academy, which still carried this Aristotelian bias. Essences, according to Aristotle, are unchanging. A thing cannot change its essence, and new essences cannot be born. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin set out both to prove that modern species were revised descendants of earlier species. Species had evolved, and to show that descent with modification had taken place. Darwin, in other words, Dennett says, had discovered the power of an algorithm. Now, to illustrate how an algorithm works, he uses the example of annealing metal, this process through heat and pressure and so forth, where the metal actually changes substantially. And this is just the application of an algorithm. And he thinks that you can pretty much account for the whole of the universe, including life, simply by reference to the working of algorithms. So Dennett says, this is Darwin's dangerous idea. The algorithmic level is the level that best accounts for the speed of the antelope, the wing of the eagle, the shape of the orchid, the diversity of species, and all the other occasions for wonder in the world of nature. Incredible as it may seem, the entire biosphere is the outcome of nothing but a cascade of algorithmic processes feeding on chance. Who designed the cascade? Nobody. It is itself the outcome of a blind algorithmic process. Well, can this really be a theory of everything? Daniel Dennett certainly believes it can. He says, if the redesign of organisms could be a mindless algorithmic process of evolution, why could that process itself not be the product of evolution? And so forth, all the way down the cosmic pyramid. And if mindless evolution could account for the breathtakingly clever artifacts of the biosphere, how could the products of our own minds be exempt from an evolutionary explanation? So there is now no need, in other words, for a final cause in the sense that Aristotle spoke of a final cause. It's just this open-ended process. It's not guided, it's completely open-ended. Well, what about consciousness, you might ask? Well, Dennett has an explanation for this as well. He thinks, of course, consciousness is simply a property of brain function, and he suggests that perhaps the brain is like a very complex quantum computer. And so this is a view known as materialism. It's a materialistic view of human persons, in which we are really just essentially biological machines, and these biological machines create what we experience as consciousness. Well, this materialistic view of consciousness, and in fact this materialistic view of reality, is increasingly being called into question in our time, and I think this is a very healthy pattern. It's represented, for example, in this book published by Oxford University Press called The Waning of Materialism. It's a collection of essays by leading philosophers. Robert Kuhn says in the introduction, as far as I can see, materialism is a view that has no very compelling argument in its favour, and that is confronted with very powerful objections to which nothing even approaching an adequate response has been offered. The central objection, elaborated in various ways below, is that the main materialist view, quite possibly the only serious materialist view, offers no account at all of consciousness and seems incapable in principle of doing so. Another leading philosopher who has argued very much against this materialistic view of the universe, of human persons and so forth, says this in his book Mind and Cosmos. In either case, natural teleology would mean that the universe is rationally governed in more than one way, not only through the universal quantitative laws of physics that underlie efficient causation, but also through principles which imply that things happen because they are on a path that leads towards certain outcomes, notably the existence of living and ultimately of conscious organisms. So he certainly thinks there is a teleology in everything, and this is part of this return to the Aristotelian view, that he argues that there is this sense, there is a sense of mind in all things, and that there seems to be very much that it is most reasonable to recognize a guiding force in all things. Now, he's still an atheist. He has other ways of accounting for this, but there's certainly this very prominent turn against that materialist view. He goes on to say, everything living or not is constituted from elements having a nature that is both physical and non-physical, that is capable of combining into mental wholes. So this reductive account can also be described as a form of panpsychism, all the elements of the physical world are also mental. That's basically the way that Thomas Nagel goes with this. So panpsychism is the view that in order to account for the existence of consciousness, and because many people find it completely untenable that consciousness could be an emergent property just of physical mechanical processes, however complex, and so they posit the idea that that actually mind is actually one of the fundamental basic elements of all reality. Well, panpsychism is a view that you can look into. The Australian philosopher David Chalmers is one of the key advocates of this position, and it is a very interesting position. It's really, in some ways, akin to Spinoza's view. His monistic view. It's akin in some ways to Hinduism. It has lots of different connections, even to Hegelianism in a way. So again, and of course, it is very much related to Aristotle's view as well. So you get this. We're getting this kind of revival of a slightly more mystical view of the universe, but and of all reality. But of course, it's a view that still doesn't really want God to be a part of it. It's interesting to note actually that Thomas Nagel, in accounting for his atheism, actually admits that he actually just doesn't like the idea of God. He doesn't think you can disprove God, and he still thinks that it's something, that it's a worthy contender, but he doesn't believe in God mainly, really, because he just doesn't like the idea. He's very candid about that. I want to turn now to some of the key critiques of the Enlightenment, that is, this Enlightenment way of thinking, because there have been a number of very significant critiques over and against the idea that this was all progress, and there's no denying that there was progress in some key areas here, but there are also some very key problems that emerged out of the so-called Enlightenment. Of course, the very idea of the Enlightenment is set over and against the so-called Dark Ages. Warren Hollister says the idea of the Dark Ages is an indestructible fossil of self-congratulatory Renaissance humanism. Rodney Stark says the myth of the Enlightenment is that suddenly in the 16th century enlightened secular forces burst the chains of Christian thought and set the foundation for modern times. What the proponents of Enlightenment actually initiated was the tradition of angry secular attacks on religion in the name of science. Probably the first really compelling critique of that whole Enlightenment way of thinking, and I'm going back here to Descartes, this subject-object issue, is in the work of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. Kierkegaard basically calls out this whole agenda to sort of stand outside reality like God, and look in on reality. I mean, he says, how can we possibly think that we can ever have this perspective? We are actually inside reality. We can't treat reality, we can't treat existence as an object. We're on the inside, and so he takes issue with this whole way of knowing, and he does this at a very sophisticated philosophical level. Denying that this objective perspective, something that he saw, for example, in Hegel. Hegel he saw as someone who was kind of standing outside of reality, looking at the way that all of reality unfolds. Classic sort of objectivist, and he just thinks that this is playing God. We can't. Who do these objectivists think they really are? I mean, it's this. He sort of diagnoses it as a kind of a God complex. This idea that we can stand in this buffered sense, standing outside of reality and looking in as though we were God. This Kierkegaard thinks is completely absurd, and he spares no wit in ridiculing the objectivist philosophers for thinking that they can stand outside of existence and sort of look in, as it were, from the outside. He says if an existing individual were really able to transcend himself, the truth would be for him something final and complete. Modern philosophy, he says, has tried anything and everything in the effort to help the individual transcend himself objectively, which is a wholly impossible feat. Existence exercises its restraining influence. He says, how can it help to explain to a man how the eternal truth is to be understood eternally when the supposed user of the explanation is prevented from so understanding it through being an existing individual, and merely becomes fantastic when he imagines himself to be subspecie eterni? And so he's critiquing there, of course, that position of Spinoza. He says then, existence itself mocks everyone who is engaged in becoming purely objective. Well, the next philosopher who really mounted a very concentrated critique on that sort of Cartesian dualism was Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger actually draws heavily from Kierkegaard. Most of Martin Heidegger's ideas find their origin in Kierkegaard, in my view. He said the desire to philosophize from the standpoint of standpointlessness, it's that sort of objective point of view, as a purportedly genuine and superior objectivity is either childish or, as is usually the case, disingenuous. This just isn't the way that things are, Heidegger points out. We don't relate to the world as subjects to objects. Our sense of self, even our very sense of self, actually includes the world. We are inside it in this sense. We're part of our world, and we only have this inside perspective. And in fact, our very view of ourselves actually, at a phenomenological level, that is the way that we experience our own self, very much includes an interaction with the external world. So you can't really set one off from the other as Descartes did, according to Heidegger. It is unnatural for us, he argues, to think that the mind and the external world are somehow set off against each other. Descartes, according to Heidegger, did something artificial here that renders our situation in an artificial way. The world, he argues, and this is a summary of what Heidegger says. He's much less clear in the way that he writes, so these are sort of summaries of the way that Heidegger thinks. The world as picture, Heidegger argues, is the world as object, as an object of knowledge and representation, as an object of use and disposal. Accordingly, the human self is conceived as subject, as knower and interpreter of the world, as object, and as user and disposer of the world, which is there to be mastered and possessed. So he's really taking issue with this idea of the world as an object and the knower as a subject, and he thinks this causes all sorts of problems, including this idea that the world is just there to be mastered and possessed. In modern secularism, Heidegger argues, man has freed himself from both the intuition of being and from his location in the divine schema as specified in Christian revelation. From this fresh autonomous vantage point, as the supreme subject, modern man has sought to apprehend being rather than being apprehended by it. He has sought to dominate nature rather than being its steward. He says the fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as picture. Okay, so the world, we view reality as like this kind of objective picture. In his role as subject, Heidegger argues, man has conceived of the world as a picture, as an object, as a structured image which he represents and sets before himself. And he, as I said, he thinks this is a completely artificial way of relating to the world. In this way, he argues, man strives for a position from and by which he can be that particular being who gives measure and draws up the guidelines for everything that is. Man, at the apex of reality, seeks to rule and dominate the cosmos and to interpret it and arrange it as he wills. So this is it's a very it's a very biblical sort of view, even though Heidegger, I mean, he actually begun by studying for the priesthood, but he ends up moving right away from any belief in God. But these are very sort of theological ideas at heart. Well, the next very interesting critique of Enlightenment comes from Adorno and Horkheimer, who were the founders of the so-called Frankfurt School and of critical theory. In their book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, they make this statement: Enlightenment is totalitarian. And what they mean by this is that the Enlightenment kind of sets boundaries for knowledge that are, in a sense, a kind of intellectual totalitarianism, that true knowledge can only come about in this way through the scientific method, and all other forms of knowledge are invalid, and they see that as a kind of intellectual totalitarianism. Myth, they say, becomes enlightenment, and nature mere objectivity. Human beings purchase the increase in their power with estrangement from that over which it is exerted. Enlightenment stands in the same relationship to things as the dictator to human beings. He knows them to the extent that he can manipulate them. The man of science knows things to the extent that he can make them. Nature, stripped of qualities, becomes the chaotic stuff of mere classification, and the all-powerful self becomes a mere having, an abstract identity. I think these are very astute observations. The distance of subject from object, they argue, the presupposition of abstraction is founded on the distance from things which the ruler attains by means of the ruled. So there's something about this that is kind of akin to Foucault's view, this idea that this is all just a power game, and this kind of also relates to Heidegger's point that, and certainly to Kierkegaard's more theistic point, that this is all just, there's a kind of God complex at work here, in which human beings are just trying to control everything and take this godlike perspective on reality. They go on to say, human beings believe themselves free of fear when there is no longer anything unknown. Nothing is allowed to remain outside, since the mere idea of the outside is the real source of fear. In line with this is a very interesting article by a evolutionary biologist called Austin Hughes, called The Folly of Scientism, published in the New Atlantis. And he takes issue with scientism, with the whole endeavour and the sort of philosophy behind this scientism. He says, when I decided on a scientific career, one of the things that appealed to me about science was the modesty of its practitioners. The typical scientist seemed to be a person who knew one small corner of the natural world and knew it very well, better than most other human beings living, and even better than most who had ever lived. But outside of their circumscribed areas of expertise, scientists would hesitate to express an authoritative opinion. This attitude was attractive precisely because it stood in sharp contrast to the arrogance of the philosophers of the positivist tradition, who claimed for science and its practitioners a broad authority with which many practicing scientists were themselves uncomfortable. The temptation, he says, to overreach, however, seems increasingly indulged today in discussions about science, both in the work of professional philosophers and in popular writings by natural scientists, and he's probably thinking of the likes of Richard Dawkins. It is frequently claimed that natural science does or soon will constitute the entire domain of truth, and this attitude is becoming more widespread amongst scientists themselves. And of course he thinks this is just a preposterous idea. You cannot, limit reality to the to what science can potentially deal with. Well, even worse than this, though, there is a sense in which, for all that science has to offer, and let's not be negative about science, there is lots of wonderful things about science, but it has, this is partly because of its, its over application. It has been argued that science and the scientific mindset, particularly within our culture, has led to a kind of an alienation, and this is essentially what Charles Taylor gets to. He says, and I've used this quote previously, science in helping to disenchant the universe contributed to opening the way for exclusive humanism. A crucial condition for this was a new sense of the self and its place in the cosmos, not open and porous and vulnerable to a world of spirits and powers, but what I want to call buffered. Now, an interesting comparison here between two different kinds of pictures of the world. One from Francis Bacon, the originator of science, and he pictured a utopia in his book, The New Atlantis, a kind of scientific utopia. And behind this, was this sort of presupposition that this new form of knowledge, was going to lead to a utopia. Dostoevsky questions this. Now, I don't think, necessarily explicitly referring to Bacon, but implicitly he questions this in a very interesting short story. This short story, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, it's a really interesting short story, and I recommend it to you. He basically Dostoevsky imagines a perfect world. It's a man who has a dream, and in his dream he goes to a sort of copy of the earth that hasn't experienced a fall, and he describes the people in this new world. And he suggests actually that they have a higher form of knowledge than scientific knowledge. And what he describes is a kind of relational knowledge. They have a sort of perfect relationship with the world around them. It's a relational knowledge. It's a knowledge through love. It's a knowledge of being rightly placed within the world, rightly relating to their environment, and it's a very interesting and compelling picture. But the key and interesting aspect of this is this suggestion of Dostoevsky's that there is a higher form of knowledge than scientific knowledge, and I think this is a good corrective in our time, where scientific knowledge is almost automatically seen as the highest form of knowledge. But is it really the highest form of knowledge? Is there a way of relating even to the natural world? Is there a way of knowing that is a higher way of knowing even than scientific knowledge? Well, that's it's a very interesting question, and certainly Dostoevsky sort of prompts that question in this short story. From a Christian point of view, particularly, one might see this scientism as part of essentially of a human pursuit of divinity. Of course, the original temptation, Genesis chapter 3, and we'll look at this in more detail in a subsequent module. But it was a temptation to be like God, and so there is this sort of God complex. And for all that's positive about science, one might see it in perhaps more negative terms as part of this human pursuit of divinity. This is actually made explicit in this book by the Israeli intellectual Yuval Noah Harari, this book called Homo Deus. He says in this book, in seeking bliss and immortality, humans are in fact trying to upgrade themselves into gods, not just because these are divine qualities, but because in order to overcome old age and misery, humans will first have to acquire godlike control of their own biological substratum. He goes on to say, in the 21st century, the third big project of humankind will be to acquire for us divine powers of creation and destruction and upgrade Homo sapiens into Homo Deus. So, he sees us as very much as a part of this sort of scientific progress as, moving from Homo sapiens into what he refers to as Homo Deus, being this sort of all-controlling creatures, and so he certainly is willing to admit, and of course he Yuval Noah Harari is an atheist, but he's willing to admit that essentially there is this agenda to acquire powers that in past times have been seen as the exclusive property of God or of the gods. So he's very straightforward about that. So that is perhaps perhaps a more negative view, and it doesn't invalidate the pursuit of science, but it certainly places the pursuit of science within a theological narrative that, from a Christian point of view, is dominated by of course the fall and human corruption, and certainly there are redemptive strands through that, and we could see indeed science and even the rise of science was very much instigated by the Christian worldview. So there's plenty of things about science that is that really arose out of the Christian worldview, and that science owes a lot to Christianity. But of course, in the hands of human beings and with their God complex, we will use any good thing in the wrong way, and so there is this sense in which this kind of scientistic way of thinking is really the outgrowth of this, theologically speaking, this God complex. Well, I hope that's given you plenty to think about as we've traced some of the strands, philosophical strands and cultural strands that have led to essentially the sort of secular mindset aspects of our culture, those very skeptical aspects of our secular culture. And I've just really touched on some of these things, but there's plenty there that you can look into for yourselves. But that concludes our session on the secular age.